All right, we are in the Kuzari on page 283. That's subparagraph 13 on page 283. So in the middle of the page. So far, in our discussion of what a saintly person is all about, something that we all would hopefully strive to be, we've talked about his meticulousness in his observance of Hashem's commandments, his appreciation for what the mitzvos do for our lives, his awareness of Hashem, right? And that was what we did in the last paragraph, where we talked about his invoking the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in Pirkei Avos. Look at three things and you'll never come to sin. That there is a seeing eye and a hearing ear, and all of your deeds are recorded in some kind of book. So he's got a tremendous awareness and an appreciation for Hashem, his world. And our next topic of what the saintly person has an appreciation of is what reality is. And I guess, we're becoming more philosophical. But when a person looks at everyday life and he's able to find a miracle in everything that exists in everyday life, this is one symptom that you may be a chassid, you may be a saint. There's like that, this comedian says, you may be a redneck if, if you drive a truck or whatever it is. So you may be a saint if, when you wake up every morning and you realize that your heart is still beating and your limbs are still working and the sun has still risen in the east, and you take that all as a miracle, then that's a sign of saintliness on your part, because you appreciate that everything that happens in the world, just because it happened a day ago and 1,000 years ago and 5 minutes ago, doesn't mean that it's any less miraculous or phenomenal than something that would be out of the ordinary. Because ultimately, there's an architecture to this world that Hashem designed, and Hashem maintains that architecture on a constant basis. So let's see how Rabbi Yehuda Halevi expresses this idea. He appreciates that all of his limbs were created wisely, with order and proper measure. He observes that they respond to his desire, although he does not understand how their mobility works. Meaning that I know that my legs work most of the time, and that my arms work, and they respond to my impulses, because if I want to move my hand this way, it just moves without my having to think about, how it does it work, that when I want in my head for my arm to move, how does it move? How does that whole very elaborate system that connects the brain with the nerves and the muscles, how does that work? He doesn't understand it. For example, when one wishes to rise, he finds that all his limbs automatically help and respond, and before he can even identify the specific limbs, his whole body has risen. The same is true when he wishes to walk, sit, or do any other activity. This is what King David was alluding to when he said, Atayadatu shivti v'kumi. You, Hashem, know my sitting and rising up. Orchi v'riv'i zeirisa v'chol derachai hiskanta. You measured my walking and my repose, and you know all my ways. And what this pasuk, what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is extracting from this pasuk is that only you, Hashem, understand this very elaborate system. Now, it's true that perhaps since the 12th century, when this paragraph was written, we understand even more about the central nervous system and how the brain interacts with our nervous system and our muscles, and we have a better understanding of the anatomical, all of the different parts of the human anatomy, but it still doesn't explain why it works the way it works. In other words, we know how it works, but we don't know why it should work the way that it works. Meaning that there has to be some kind of what philosophers call a teleology, which means the word itself implies that there is a sentience or a consciousness that designed the way things are. Because everything works so elegantly. And like the Gemara gives as an example, the Gemara describes a conversation between a great sage and a heretic. And the heretic says, how do you prove God's existence? And the rabbi said, well, here I want to show you a beautiful poem that was composed just a few minutes ago. And the fellow reads it, and it's a beautiful prose. And he says, who wrote this? He says, no one wrote it. I had an inkwell of ink and a blank piece of paper right next to it. And a cat came by and knocked over the inkwell. And the ink spilled out in such a way that it just by coincidence formed the letters that created this magnificent poem. And of course the heretic said that's impossible. And that's what the rabbi said, exactly, precisely. When you see a structure, when you see this designed by intelligence, when you see this teleology, you understand that there is a great design at play. And we don't necessarily have to understand how the entire design system works, but other than to acknowledge that it does work, that there's great structure and great wisdom. And we've talked about this before in the idea that a saintly person also appreciates that Hashem could have made it in a much more primitive way and a much less colorful way. The fact that when I look outside, whether the streets are covered with snow, or whether the leaves are green, or whether they're yellow, or whether there are no leaves at all, the world looks actually beautiful. There's an aesthetic to the world as well. So there's functionality, there's aesthetics, there's beauty, and there's great wisdom behind everything that works. So this is what's going through the Chassid's mind, and he has a great appreciation, and he's constantly amazed. He's just like, at every moment, he's just, I can't believe this. This is incredible. I'm alive. My body works. And that's why we make the bracha of Asher Yatzar when we come out of the bathroom, is that I can't believe that God made me with a body that I abuse so much. You know, when you think about all the chazarai that we put into our mouths, and the way that we don't treat our bodies well, and yet for whatever reason, the body bounces back, and it expels all of the chazarai that we ingested, and our bodies are still working after all these years. I mean, if you purchased an appliance, the finest German appliance that you could think of, the longest lasting appliance, how many years would it last? 10 years, 20 years if you're lucky. Our appliances have been running for quite a long time. We may need to replace a tooth or here and there. We may need to replace even a hip or a knee at some point as we get really old. But by and large, our appliances are just amazing, the way that they are able to work. And this is really what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is remarking about. He says, that's the approach that a Chassid has. It's just constant amazement at the tremendous wisdom in Hashem's creation just by looking at his own body and his own purview of experience. And he continues, even more acute and amazing are the organs that control speech. Just look at how even a small child can repeat anything he hears without understanding which organs, muscles, and nerves allow him to do so. Also, the chest organs allow one to sing musically. The singer reproduces and beautifies the musical notes without knowing how his body does it. It seems as if God produces the notes and operates his vocal cords whenever cause arises. So, the more sophisticated the creature is, the more amazing the functions of that creature are. In other words, we have the intelligence to appreciate that even the things that human beings only can uniquely do are even more amazing than the things that we share with animals. What's more incredible, that we have a great appliance called a body that has mobility, or that our appliance can actually communicate with speech? The speech, the skill of communication is an even greater sort of feat of architecture than even the feat of mobility. I suppose that anyone can create a robot, but it's much harder to create a robot with sentience that has the ability to communicate at whim. And imagine even more difficult is to get a machine to sing and to play music. So that's the so that at its will, without being commanded to do so. So that's the amazing part of the production of words, the production of music. All of this seems to happen miraculously, but as a matter of will. But it seems as if God produces the notes and operates his vocal cords whenever cause arises. I don't know how it is that I can carry a tune. For those of us who can carry a tune, it's a tremendous gift. I don't take any pride in it because it was something given to me by Hashem. But I don't know how it works. I just know that when I want to hit a certain note, it comes out, most of the time it comes out that way. And I don't know how it works because I don't have an instrument. I've never taken lessons about how to hit a certain note. It almost seems as if Hashem allows me to do that. And he says, as a matter of fact, that is what actually happens or thereabouts, because divine creation is not the same as human labor. For example, when a builder builds a mill, the mill will continue to do what it was built to do even after the builder goes elsewhere. However, the blessed Creator creates limbs, gives them strength, and is with them every moment. Were God to remove his providence and supervision even for one moment, if we can imagine such a thing, the entire universe would cease to exist. This requires a significant amount of unpacking, because it is not something that we, in our everyday lives and in the way that we think today in the 21st century, would submit that prima facie this necessarily has to be true. But the medieval belief was that in order for existence to continue functioning, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to be constantly providential. There has to be constant hashgacha in order for the world to continue functioning. If Hashem were to decide to withdraw himself entirely from existence or from the physical world, even for a millisecond, the world would cease to exist. Now, in Kabbalah, this makes a lot of sense, because really, from a Kabbalistic perspective, the physical world is really the reduction of Hashem, but nothing exists outside of God. So there's no way for God to withdraw himself any further from the physical world than he already is withdrawn. But you don't have to be a Kabbalist to appreciate that we say this in our prayers every single day. We say in the prayers that Hashem is HaMechadesh B'tuvo B'chol Yom Tamid Ma'aseh Bereshis, that God renews creation on a constant basis. And the Sfarim, like the Kuzari and many others, write that Hashem is in a constant state of creation. It's not that God created the world and then let it run, but that he is constantly in a creative state because he needs to maintain the universe, because the universe is part of Hashem's thinking. Were Hashem to withdraw himself, if such a thing were even possible, then there would be no reality and the universe would cease to exist. Now, this is not the way we think today. Yeah.
I heard once an explanation for, I don't know how popular it is, for the Holocaust, that they said that during that time God withdrew his presence from the world. That's why the Holocaust happened, because he withdrew his presence, and that's why all those things, because the question was always like, why did, how did God allow that to happen, and why didn't he intervene? So I heard this a long time ago, somebody said that during that time he removed his presence from, I don't know
Well, there is a concept called hester panim in the Torah. The Torah says, "Venochi haster panai bayom hahu." I will hide my face in the time of diaspora persecution. That's what Hashem calls it. Hashem says, I will withdraw my face or my supervision from the world. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and others really say that it's really impossible to take that at face value. God can't withdraw himself completely from the universe and the universe continue to exist. He is constantly involved in the process of maintenance of what is going on. It's not even maintenance, it's that every single moment God is constantly giving substance to the universe. It's almost like the way that the universe has to stay in existence is if you're a juggler, you got to keep throwing up the balls. If you stop the motion, then the world stops to exist. Philosophers in the medieval period put it in terms of motion. They said the universe is in constant motion. There therefore must be a mover who is constantly moving everything along. And therefore, when we say in using arguments of theodicy about why bad things happen, that God withdraws his presence, it means that he allows for evil choices to take place. But it doesn't mean that he's not involved with that practice. There are many times when God does not conflict with human choice. But there are times when Hashem does conflict with human choice. If a person were to wake up one day and say, I want to invent a bomb and drop it on the top of New York City and wipe out a few million people, it stands to reason that Hashem would intervene in some way and prevent that from coming to fruition if Hashem indeed does not want 1 million people or more to die. However, there are times when Hashem says, the decree against New York City is such that they don't deserve my divine protection, and therefore if someone were to decide to do that, I will not interfere with their free will thinking. I will not create interference with that effort. But it doesn't mean that Hashem is any less involved with the building blocks, with the reality of our universe. So, and therefore we even pronounce this. Gam ki elech begeit salmaves lo irara ki atoim adi. This is what a favorite refrain of many people who were immersed in the death camps. Even if I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear not, because you are with me. And what that is an affirmation of is that even though God may have hidden his face and does not allow us to understand the divine wisdom of why these things are happening, Hashem is with us in our most desperate hour, because it's impossible for God to detach himself from the universe. Yes?
I read this book by Rabbi Victor Miller called Divine Madness, and it explains why Hashem brought the Holocaust, if anybody's interested.
Yeah. I don't read those books because I find myself with more questions than answers. But if you find comfort in those things, by all means. So again, this is not really our discussion today is not revolving around why bad things happen to good people, but rather to really understand it's an even more basic principle, which is there can be no existence without Hashem's involvement. And therefore, there are many phenomena that occur, even within our own bodies, that we can't really account for. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's sort of offering for that is that Hashem is constantly involved in the maintenance and the constant recreation of everything that exists. So a chassid is aware of that. He takes tremendous gratitude for that idea. There is a tremendous amount of philosophical debate within Rebbe Yehuda's lifetime about how exactly precisely this works. You know, I think it was Alexander Pope who said that a philosopher is someone who debates for endless hours on how many angels can fit on the head of a pin. And many times those kinds of discussions are not productive. But those are the kinds of discussions and debates that were taking place in the lifetime of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi among people who he will address as at the end of the book called the Mutikalimun. There were people who were part of the Islamic community who were very much involved in a type of philosophical speculation that in Arabic is known as kalam. Kalam is simply discussion or words that try and explain how God interacts with our physical universe. And there was a tremendous amount of debate, like, you're a heretic, no, you're a heretic. Everyone was being accused of heresy for trying to explain in one way or the other about how God influences creation. The Rambam himself had a great debate with one of the Mutikalimun, where he ridiculed a certain proposition that was made by one of the Kalamists, who suggested that when you throw a ball up in the air and you let it fall and you catch it, what has just happened? So the Kalamist said that really there are an infinite number of balls that were created from the time that you threw the ball up in the air until the time it landed in your hand. And God was constantly recreating at every frame of the film a new creation. He created a new you, he created a new ball, and the ball just, in this new creation, just repositioned itself ever so slightly. And so there's millions, if not trillions, of balls going up and coming down, and the ball that you catch is not the same ball that you threw up in the air, because God is constantly recreating the entire universe. The Rambam said that there may be some truth to that, but the danger, the inherent danger in believing that is that man, in a sense, loses his sense of free will if he views himself as just part of an endless, infinite amount of creations, that I'm not the same person that I was a moment ago. And so there's a tremendous amount of debate going back and forth as far as how to understand this model. So we're going to try and keep it simple and just point out that the Jewish belief in a teleology is far more profound, or sort of requires God's involvement more than, let's say, what most people believe today. Even most people who believe in a God today do not necessarily subscribe to this teleological model that I've just described for you, that God is mechadesh b'tuvo b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reishis, that God is constantly involved and recreating constantly the universe. Most people, ever since the advent of Sir Isaac Newton, believe in what's called a mechanistic universe, or God is the great watchmaker. You may have heard that term being used before. What is the watchmaker theory? The watchmaker theory is that God, at the beginning of time, created a universe, just like a watchmaker builds a watch, wound it up, and it's still now moving. The whole world is still functioning and still going. And that's the way Newton described it. Now, Newton himself, and this is something that historians of philosophy debate, Newton himself still believed in a providential God, that God is constantly involved. But there were some students of Newton, like most markedly Voltaire, who was a bit of a cynic. And he said, okay, I accept the fact that God is a watchmaker, he wound up the universe, but he's gone off. Once you wind up the clock, you don't have to constantly be looking at it to make sure it's still ticking. So he believed that while there was a God who was a creator, there's intelligent design. A belief in a creator and an intelligent design does not necessitate a belief that God is still involved with the universe. Maybe he created everything a few million years ago, and then he went to some other universe and started to play with that, and is making another watch somewhere else. So that's what a lot of people believe in today, since Newton described the laws of motion. And he said that once everything was put into motion, you see, up until Newtonian physics came along in the 17th century, you didn't have to, there was only one way to understand how everything could be in motion. Everything is in motion because there's a mover. But once Newton came along and he said, no, if there was an initial inertia, there was sufficient inertia in the first push, So then you don't need a constant mover to constantly make sure things are moving. So for example, how are the planets still in motion to this very day? If you ask a scientist, what will they tell you? Is there some angel constantly pushing the Earth around the sun? That's not what's happening, right? How does the Earth continue to revolve around the sun? There's gravitational force, there's electromagnetic force, there's the strong force, there's the weak force. There's centrifugal force that keeps the planets, preventing them from leaving their orbit. So the movement of our planets, our understanding in science today, does not necessitate this model that has just been described. Do you understand? Am I making myself clear? In other words, our affirmation that God is mechadesh b'tuvo b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reishit is not scientifically provable as it was half a millennium ago. It requires more faith, an affirmation of faith that we understand that without God, the universe simply cannot exist, based on the teachings that we have going back to our earliest Chazal and to the Tanakh. But there's nothing in the world that we can observe to say, aha, you see, the world cannot exist without a God. I hope that's clear. Is it, Mrs. Sakhachevsky, what are you laughing about?
No, because you just explained this very complicated thing about how the world runs, and you summed it all up by saying, I hope that's clear. It just seemed, I don't know, amusing to me.
Okay. Good. Okay.
I kind of lost the last sentence before. The previous two, I hope that's clear. Or just the sentence.
You know, when I say I hope that's clear, it shows my insecurity that maybe I'm only talking to myself. So whenever I say I hope that's clear, then you should say, no, it's not clear. And you better make a point of explaining it, because I don't want my time to be wasted.
But
And
Rabbi, is there really a difference? I mean, I understand.
Okay, so hold on a second. So I'm going to explain what I mean. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi believes, based on the science of his day, that the world can't continue existing without a God. What I've just said is, that's all well and good if you live in the 12th century. If you live in the 20th or 21st century like we do, even if you lived 100 years ago or 200 years ago, even 300 years ago, as long as you were lived after Sir Isaac Newton, who revolutionized the rules of physics, you don't need a God to maintain the movement of our universe. That's the watchmaker theory, is that God could have, if you believe that God is responsible for all motion in the universe, he just wound up this big clock, put all of the laws of physics into motion with a big push and a big wind up, and everything is continuing according to that original wind up. That's why, people who are truly neurotic worry about the sun going nova. Our sun eventually is, where the sun is a big ball of gas, and eventually, there's no truck that's going to pull up to the sun and put more gas, fill it up when it runs out of gas. So what's going to happen when the sun runs out of helium and hydrogen? It's going to turn into a giant red sun, and eventually it'll collapse and it'll supernova. Okay? But the good news is that's not going to happen for about another 4 billion years. So if you're really neurotic, you can start worrying about it now. So the point is that this is something that scientists tell us based upon the current architecture of our solar system and based upon scientific knowledge that we have about how the world physically runs. Because God wound up the universe at some point very early on, the world will eventually the sun will run out of gas, and everything will explode and will cease to exist. And that's fine, because there are billions and trillions of solar systems. So when our solar system shuts down, there'll be a new star that's born somewhere else, and that's just the way the universe runs. So you see, that ascribes a certain mechanistic functioning to our universe, okay? So my point is simply this. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is awed when he sees creation, he sees everything moving, and he says, I can only account for this by God's constant involvement in the movements of the world. We have the challenge of either being awed like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is, or being nonplussed based upon what science tells us today. And it creates a greater challenge because it allows, there's always an escape hatch, because the more we discover in science, the more opportunity there is to write God out of science. There's also greater opportunity to write God into science, because the more we discover, the more amazing we find the universe to be. And the more structure and design we perceive in this amazing universe, this physical world. But at the same time, we have to resign ourselves to the fact that you can't prove God's existence to someone who doesn't want to believe, because there's always the opportunity to find a way out. Yes. Who else was?
But those scientific labels for what happens in the world, I don't really see that that's a contradiction to believing that Hashem is the one who's making it happen. You might want to call it centrifugal force, fine, call it whatever you want. But that doesn't mean that Hashem is not the one who's making that happen. So I don't see...
Right, but yet you're right, although one is, before the advent of the theory of centrifugal force and all of the other forces, you had no choice but to accept that there's something moving this currently right now. Look, if I take my phone and I slide it across this table, how did it get from this point to that point? What's the answer? I pushed it. Now, is it necessary to believe scientifically that God pushed it? God caused it to move? No. See, we think automatically in a Newtonian fashion. We know clearly that it was the force from my arm that filled this phone with the inertia to move across the table. But people in earlier times believed that the only way things move is through God moving them on a constant basis.
But why? I always thought it's like a combination. It's like cruise control. You can put your car on cruise control, but you can always put your foot on the brake to override the cruise control. Hashem did set up the world with a certain system that goes b'derech hateva, what we call nature. So that's the cruise control. But he can still step in at any moment and say, no, this
right.
is
So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is not talking about cruise control. That's exactly what he's not saying. What he's saying is that the car can't exist without God constantly saying, car exist. You understand what I'm saying? As I, as the driver, am not, and that's the contrast. He says, when a builder builds a mill, the mill will continue to do what it was built to do, even after the builder goes elsewhere. However, the blessed Creator creates limbs, gives them strength, and is with them every moment. Were God to remove his providence and supervision even for one moment, the entire universe would cease to exist. So it's not cruise control.
But Hashem did create the world with certain laws that are there. I mean, why did he create all the things he was going to need later on during the 6 days of creation for later on, if he was going to, like he set it up in a certain way, and then depending on how much intervention you are worthy of, that's how much you're going to get.
Right. There is a discussion of nature early on in the book. I just want to bring your attention to it. Turn to page 87 for just a moment. I know we're running out of time, but I just want to, maybe we'll do this more a little bit later on. Page 87. The rabbi said to the Khazar king, and this is early on in the Khazar king's belief system, so he's not fully convinced. The rabbi said, trying to explain how things work, the wisdom that you see involved in the creation of an ant, for example, do you attribute this wisdom to some star or other heavenly force other than God, who is truly omnipotent and exact and who provides each and everything with its exact properties? And the Khazar responds, he says, what are you talking about, God? These properties are attributed to nature. The rabbi asked, and what exactly is nature? The Kuzari said, it is a certain force within the universe which, I grant you, I do not understand clearly, but the wise scientists know precisely what it is. And the rabbi says, their understanding of nature is just as nebulous as ours. Aristotle defined it a bit by stating that nature is the underlying cause of all phenomena which cause change within a physical object, provided that these changes are intrinsic, not incidental to the object in question. So that's a little bit technical, but the bottom line is, if you skip to 75, the rabbi says that is the outcome of his very intricate and refined distinction between things which operate incidentally and those that operate via nature. The issues involved have fascinated many a philosopher, but this is what it boils down to. So the Khazar says, if so, then I see that we have been misled by these wise men into thinking that nature works in an intelligent fashion to affect creation, just like the Creator. But in reality, nature is really what God decides to do on a constant basis. And so for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the laws of nature are not things that are any different. The reason why we call things nature is because we're used to seeing them on a constant basis. And because we're running out of time, I want to come back to that. Your point about nature is a very valid point. I was actually the direction that I was getting into. And that's why I photocopied this piece from an essay from Rav Dessler called Hanes V'Hateva, Miracles and Nature. So if I can ask you to hold on to that until next week, that will be where we pick it up. I'd like us to take a look at a few paragraphs from that essay, and we'll get a better understanding about the different ways to look at the world. So, okay, a little bit more than we bargained for today. Let's go to our parsha. If you don't mind, if you could help me pass these out, thank you. How many plagues are in Parshas Va'era that we're going to read this week? Anyone know? 7. There are 7. 7 out of the 10. And one of the things that the commentaries undertake, or some of the commentaries undertake, is why it is that we divide the story of the plagues up into 2 parshiot. Now, you could answer that, okay, well, it just is the way it is. But there are many commentaries that find great significance in the idea of the first 7 versus the last 3. And one of those is the Rebbe of Ishbitz and his son, the Beis Yaakov, the Mei HaShiloach and the Beis Yaakov, to the father and son, Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner and his son, Rav Yaakov Leiner. And they have a lot of discussion about this idea of the 7 plagues and their relationship to the 7 deadly sins. You all know about the 7 deadly sins, don't you? Have you heard about the 7 deadly sins? How many of you have heard about the 7 deadly? I first learned about the 7 deadly sins from Captain Marvel, because I was big into comic books when I was a kid. The 7 deadly sins, Captain Marvel, Shazam, So he meets the great wizard Shazam, who teaches him about the 7 deadly sins and how he's becoming Captain Marvel to fight against all of the 7 deadly sins. But where do they really come from? The 7 deadly sins were first written at the end of the 6th century by Pope Gregory I. And he compiled a list of the famous 7 deadly sins of the Catholic Church. And those 7 deadly sins are lust, gluttony, avarice, which is another word for greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. Those are the 7 character traits that are called the 7 deadly sins. They were popularized in the 14th century by Dante in his Divine Comedy, because he talks about entering into the 7 levels of hell. That's Dante's Inferno. So you might think that this is of completely Christian origin, so why bother discussing it? The answer is that in the Tanakh, we also have 7 deadly sins. In the book of Mishlei, in the book of Proverbs. What are the 7 deadly sins of Proverbs? So Shlomo HaMelech says, Sheish hena sonei Hashem v'sheva to'avas nafsho. This is in Mishlei Perek Vav. There are 6 things which God hates, and really the 7th one added to it are really an abomination to his soul. Really, that 6 are really bad, but the 7th is even worse. So there are 7 things that are really Hashem really can't stand. So what are those? Einayim ramos, haughty eyes. Lashon sheker, a lying tongue. Yadayim shofchos dam naki, hands that shed innocent blood. Leiv choresh machshavos aven, a heart that devises wicked plans. Raglayim mimaharos larutz lara'a, feet that run rapidly to evil. Yafiach kisavim eid shaker, a false witness who utters lies. And finally, umishaleach midanim bein achim, one who spreads strife among brothers. Now, according to the Ishbitzer, Shlomo HaMelech listed these in ascending order of despicableness. That the worst one of these, the number 1 on the list that I have, is the last one who spreads strife among brothers. So therefore, what the Ishbitzer says is that Hashem, in punishing the Egyptians, chose the worst sin first and punished in descending order of plagues. So therefore, and basically the Egyptians were guilty of all of these things in their treatment of the Bnei Yisrael. And so I'll run through them with you now to look at the first 7 of the plagues. Mishaleach midanim bein achim, that God creates strife among brothers. This refers to the plague of blood. Now what does that mean? It means that when 2 people are fighting, they see red, their blood boils, they become very hot-headed, they want to punch each other out. This is what the Egyptians created between the Jews and their brother in heaven, Hashem. The Egyptians created a sense of upset. The Jewish people turned their eyes to heaven and they say, God, you've rejected us. What's going on over here? And they became upset with Hashem. Almost, we could almost say in a sense that out of all of the heinous things that the Nazis did to the Jewish people, if not the worst, one of the worst things is that they created this tremendous religious distance or rupture between the Jews and their faith, which in many ways exists even to this day. And it's very difficult to repair. So that's the first crime that the Egyptians were guilty of, and the just punishment is blood, because blood represents the anger and the seeing red that exists between 2 enemies. Number 2, Yafiach kizavim eid shaker, that's number 6, going backwards in the list, a false witness who utters lies. And the Ishbitzer says this refers to a person who is overzealous in the way that he exaggerates a person's crimes. What the Egyptians did to the Jewish people is that even for the slightest of infractions, instead of trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, they always found ways to incriminate the Jews and portray them in the worst possible light. As you can imagine, that's what the Nazi propaganda did against the Jews also, calling them vermin and portraying them as horrible people. So the just punishment is the plague of frogs, because all of their croaking against the Jews brought this incessant croaking of the frogs, which made their lives miserable. Raglayim imaharos lorutz l'ra, legs running to do evil. The Egyptians couldn't wait to execute justice against the Jews. Normally, a compassionate person says, okay, you did something wrong, let's wait a while to cool off. No. At the slightest infraction, the punishment would be instantaneous against the Jew. The whip would come down against the slave. And so the punishment is kinim. And the Ishbitzer says lice, when you observe an individual louse or a small insect under the microscope, its legs are running very, very fast. But it's not getting very far because it's such a puny creature. And that's the lesson to the Egyptians. You were so quick to run, but Hashem will make your objectives ineffectual. Next, Leiv Choresh Machshavos Aven, plotting evil thoughts in your heart. It refers to the plague of Arov, which is a whole combination of wild beasts, a mixture. The word Arov literally means a mixture of wild beasts. Hashem notes that the Egyptians were constantly thinking of new ways to subjugate the Jews, and so Hashem caused their thoughts to jumble and prevent them from thinking properly. And so how do you do that? You bring a cacophony of wild animals to completely disrupt their natural order and basically take away any sense of civil order within their society. You constantly were coming up with new ideas about how to plot against the Jews. We're going to have a complete disruption in your ability to continue that plotting forth against the Jews and completely disrupt your civilization. Yadaim Shovchos Dam Naki is the next one. Killing innocent people, and which is what the Egyptians did to innocent babies, and the punishment is dever, which is animal plague, wherein innocent livestock die gratuitously. And lashon sheker, lying, which is what the Egyptians did in order to enslave the Jews. They lied to them, they fed them propaganda, and they convinced them through clever words that the Jews would be serving society, and they were able to convince them to become slaves, and they just plain out lied to them, just like the Nazis did when they herded Jews into the cattle cars and into the showers. So, since it takes a lot of chutzpah to lie to a person's face and to look them into the face and tell them a bald-faced lie, what is the punishment for being liars in society? Hashem gives you the plague of boils. So, like the Torah says, that v'lo yachlu hachartumim la'amod mipnei Moshe lifnei Moshe mipnei hashechim. The magicians could not stand in front of Moshe because they were too humiliated because of their personal hygiene was so adversely affected because of the boils. So, boils is what means that you can't look someone in the eye anymore. Because you were so able to look the Jews in the eye and lie to them outright, Hashem will take away your ability to stand face to face to them again. And then finally, Einayim Ramos, haughty eyes, that the Egyptians viewed themselves as superior to the Jewish slaves, thinking that they were the superior race, and that they were really in control of their civilization. We are the ultimate masters and architects of our destiny. So how does God show that that's not the case? By creating a complete disruption in your meteorology, because normally man perceives that he's currying favor through rain, and you're being shown that no, that the basic forces of nature are going against you, and you no longer can say that you are the architects of your own destiny, and certainly not that the gods favor you in any way. So this is the way that the Ishbitzer discusses how the plagues were an appropriate punishment to all the things. And of course, you know that there are many Sfarim who have a different way of inventorying these things. Of the 7 plagues in this parsha, if we focus on the 4th one, which is the center plague of the parsha, there's a lot of time that the Beis Yaakov, the son of the Ishbitzer, spends on this. Arov, the plague of mixture. One unique feature of this plague is that it is the first time where Hashem says, through this plague, you will see a marked distinction between the Egyptians and the Jews. By the first 3 plagues, that claim was never made, that, the Jews will not suffer and only the Egyptians will suffer. It was only by the 4th plague of Arov, of wild beasts, where Hashem says, and this is in source number 2, V'hiflesi bayom hahu es eretz Goshen. I will make distinct on this day the town of Goshen where the Jews live, asher ami omed aleha levilti heyosham arov. That there will be no plague of Arov. Leman teida ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz, so that you know that I am Hashem in the midst of the earth. So the first time when the Torah stakes the claim that in Goshen, where the Jews are living, they will not experience the plague. So what makes this plague of Arov so important and unique, that it is the first time that this distinction is being demonstrated? So we've talked about it in previous years, but there's this very interesting commentary from the Beis Yaakov, which I'll just spend a few minutes on. If you take a look in source number 3, so he says, picking up where his father, the Ishbitzer, left off, he says, Arov hu neged leiv choresh machshavos aven, hainu ya'an shecharshu machshavot aven ech lahara li Yisrael, lazeh hevi alehem eruv b'chayot ra'ot levalvel machshavotam. As we mentioned before, that since the Egyptians were constantly plotting against the Jews how to make their lives miserable, Hashem confounded their thoughts. How do you confound someone's thoughts? By presenting them with a whole cacophony of wildness on the outside to completely disrupt their thinking process. This is why this was the appropriate punishment to the Egyptians for being cold and calculated against the Jews. Shelo yuchlu lahara li Yisrael. Ki kol ma sheratza paro lahara li Yisrael ratzu kol amo yoter v'yoter ad shelo batzu zimamam. He says, as much as Paro wanted to harm the Jews, the Egyptians were even more vicious in their desire. And Hashem refused to allow it to happen. Ki kein minag Hashem yisparach tamid b'chol eshu matzileinu miyadam, einu al yedei sheishlach lehem machshavot tavot aleinu,